This is the interview with Emlyn Griffith on December 14th, 2001.
Okay. When you entered the Army Air Corps on June 17th in 1942, where did you go for basic training?
The basic training was in Alabama.
Alabama?
Yes.
Do you know what fort or what?
Well, it was a base in South Alabama, and I've forgotten the name.
You remember what basic training was like?
Well, we were taught the rules of the service. I was in the Army Air Corps. The Air Corps was part of the Army then, and the two forces weren't separated until after World War II. And we were taught how to march and respond to orders, etc. And then I was sent to radio operator school in Florida. And I spent 3 months, I think, in radio operator school in Central Florida. And then was briefly assigned to a flying group. And then was accepted for officer candidate school. And I went through OCS at the University of Florida and was commissioned in 1943, about a year after I enlisted.
So it took about a year to get through basic.
And radio school.
And radio school.
Yeah. And officer candidate school.
Okay. And what does officer candidate school do?
Well, it was a 3-month program for enlisted personnel who were being trained to become officers. And a lot of the programs dealt with the structure of the services and with the chains of command and the responsibilities of officers, junior officers. And then there was some emphasis on history and some emphasis on what had happened after Pearl Harbor up to the date we were studying at OCS.
Okay.
And then there was one course on military strategy, and then there were also courses on the geography and the history of the countries in the European theater, and the geography and the history of the islands and mainland and the Pacific theater. Because at that point in time, we didn't know where we were going to be assigned.
Mm-hmm.
My first assignment was in Gadsden, Alabama. I was a base adjutant at an air depot in Gadsden, Alabama.
And what were your basic duties like?
Well, it was I was taking orders from the commanding officer, the colonel, but it was the daily routine was preparing orders for the colonel to sign and developing a calendar of events for the base and completing questionnaires from headquarters. It was an administrative responsibility.
Okay. After basic, was there any other specific job training or further schools that the Army sent you to?
No, all of my work after I graduated from officer candidate school and was commissioned, all my work was in the field. I didn't go back to any schools.
Okay. And during your 4-year term, you were stationed in the Pacific. Were you excited that you went to the Pacific instead of the European theater?
Well, I didn't know what I was getting into in the Pacific. I had been stationed in the United States for a while in the Mobile Air Service Command. I was an administrative officer, again on the staff of the commanding general. and preparing orders and reports. And then I was transferred to Hickam Field on Oahu in the Hawaiian Islands. And my assignment there was with an Air Force or Air Corps unit. And then we were transferred, the unit was transferred to the U.S. Army's 24th Corps. And that was, the 24th Corps was a group of battalions and Army personnel and Air Corps personnel. It was a combined unit. And I was appointed assistant to the commanding general, and again my responsibilities were quite the same as I had when I'd performed when I was an adjutant in Gadsden, Alabama. Only the level of responsibility was higher and more people were involved. But all of these assignments were really administrative assignments, assisting either the commanding colonel or the commanding general.
Oh.
And because I had been editor of my college newspaper, the commanding officers always looked for assistants who could write clearly and explain what the commanders had in mind and what the commanders expected. And so it was really, my assignments were largely communication, either in writing or oral.
And who was your commanding officer?
Well, the one I remember the most is General Chieves, who was commander of the 24th Corps. And we went first to Okinawa, and after the battle had started in Okinawa, and then we were transferred after the Japanese surrendered on Okinawa in, I think approximately either late July or early August 1945. We were, the 24th Corps was assigned to go to Kikaijima, one of the Japanese islands. We were supposed to invade Kikaijima, and we had left Buckner Bay on Okinawa on the ships headed for Japan, and Harry Truman dropped the 2 bombs, and the Japanese surrendered. And we were rerouted, the 24th Corps was rerouted to Korea, and we became the occupation force for South Korea.
When you traveled to Japan, did you feel kind of weird going into another country?
Well, we didn't land in Japan. We were diverted to Korea after President Truman dropped the 2 atomic bombs and the Japanese surrendered. But while we were in the occupation force in Korea, I was occasionally flown to Japan for communication with the occupation forces in Japan, the U.S. occupation forces. And it was their culture was a lot different than ours. It was interesting that about 20 years later, my wife and I had a Japanese student residing with us. He was attending Rome Free Academy. He was an exchange student. And his attitude was much different from the attitudes of the young people I met in 1945 and early 46. Yoshiro Goto was his name, and Yoshiro, I think, was a senior at RFA, and a very interesting young man. And he left the United States and started college in Japan, and is doing quite well. But he still writes us occasionally about his experiences at RFA. We always hear from him at Christmas time. But getting back to the occupation of Korea, the Japanese had held the Koreans under significant suppression. and they had banned the use of Korean language or English language. And they were requiring all the people in South Korea, the portion of Korea that Japan had occupied, and originally it was most of Korea, and the only English-speaking Koreans were, or almost the only English-speaking Koreans, were members of the underground Presbyterian Church. And it was interesting. Dr. Horace Underwood, who graduated from Hamilton College and whose sons were at Hamilton College when I was a student at Colgate, and we had become friends. Dr. Underwood had been in charge of the Presbyterian missionaries in Korea, and he was brought back to South Korea to assist in locating the underground Presbyterian churches. And he and I went around all of South Korea looking for these Presbyterian churches. My assignment was to establish a network of English-speaking Koreans who could be trusted during that period of occupation and who weren't Japanese spies or terrorists. And Dr. Underwood and I went from Incheon to Seoul and then down to Busan, and we located these English-speaking Koreans and established a radio network, English-speaking radio network, and an English-speaking or little weekly newspaper network written in English.
So you did find?
Yes, yeah, we found a substantial number of English-speaking Koreans, and Dr. Underwood was very active. The State Department had brought him over to help with that project, and he was very effective in locating these English-speaking Koreans and helped the American troops establish these two networks, English-speaking radio programs and English-language weekly newspapers.
Did it take long to set up the network?
Yes, yes. I was in Korea from September of 1944 till, well, April of 1945, late April. And, from September of 1945 to April of 1946. And most of my time there was involved in those we're working with Dr. Underwood in establishing those networks. So that was my major assignment in Korea.
Great.
And we coordinated with the Army Air Corps and the U.S. Army, coordinated with the State Department initiatives in the portions of the Pacific area that the Japanese had occupied.
Did you ever suspect that one of the English-speaking Koreans were a spy?
Well, we never discovered one who was, but I wasn't in the intelligence field, and so that wasn't my responsibility, really. But no, we never had an incident where one of our network members was identified as a spy, but there was concern about the Japanese possibly having spies remain in Korea. But that threat didn't materialize, at least in the activities that I was involved in.
Okay. So there was never a time where you were ever under any kind of enemy fire?
Well, in Okinawa, we got shot at occasionally by snipers. The Battle of Okinawa didn't end until early August, and So I was there about 3 months while the battle was still going on. But the American troops had really pushed the Japanese back. And so the Japanese army wasn't really very effective. But there were snipers in Okinawa while the war was still going on. And we would occasionally get shot at. And fortunately, the snipers weren't all that accurate.
So there weren't any casualties from the snipers?
Well, in the unit that I was with, no, but there were casualties in other units because the battle was still going on. The Japanese didn't surrender until mid-August of August 15th. 1945. So during the month, the invasion of Okinawa had begun in April, and the U.S. Army had really taken control by the end of May, and I got there mid-May, and so the battles were still going on. But in June and July, it was really the active warfare was winding down, and so the threats were snipers and not combat troops, really.
Right. Did you get any decorations or medals?
Well,
I have here two of them.
I don't have them with me.
It's okay.
I think I got I got one battle star for Okinawa, and then I got a
victory medal?
Yes, and I think an Army commendation medal.
What did it take to get those?
Well, to get the battle star, you had to be on Okinawa during the months that the war was still going on. And the commendation medal was for my service in Korea. And the victory medal was actually given to everybody who was in the Pacific theater at the time the Japanese surrendered. So those medals weren't indications of heroism. They were just, they represented months of service in the theater.
Right. When President Truman dropped the bombs, what was your reaction?
Well, as I said, we were headed for the Japanese islands, and we were scheduled to invade Kikajima. And we were very relieved. And I wasn't going to be in the first unit to land. I was going to be with the general behind the invasion lines. But we were all very relieved because the Japanese troops in Japan and the Japanese islands far outnumbered the American troops. And as it turned out, after the Japanese surrendered, the intelligence service discovered that there were 2 more divisions on Kikajima than our intelligence had indicated. So if the 24th Corps units would have really been outnumbered. And so there had been severe casualties. And the feeling among the troops in the Pacific was relief. We regretted the loss of the lives of the Japanese civilians, but again, as we are now faced with the issue of the war, issues involved in the war on terrorism, you've got to balance the risks and the losses. And as it turns out, I think the Japanese would have lost many, many, many more people had we had to invade the islands and Korea and the areas being held by the Japanese army. And there would have been many, many more military casualties and civilian casualties.
says here, when you left the service, it says you weren't discharged.
No, officers were given leave of absence, and I was still in the reserves. I stayed in the reserves for about 5 years, 4.5 years, and so you were just put on actually terminal leave, but you remained technically under the control of the commanders, or at least the War Department. And the enlisted personnel were, quote, discharged, quote.
Okay.
But the officer personnel were released from active duty and subject to recall. And especially those of us who were still in the reserves. I was in the reserve all through my 3 years at Cornell Law School. And in fact, I spent my, I think, 2 summers at West Point studying the transition from of the Air Corps from the Army to the Air Force, an independent unit.
So what was it like at West Point? Was it?
Well, it was different than law school. It was. I was impressed. The 2 summers I was at West Point, I think that it was a 6-week tour, and I was impressed. I thought the faculty members were very committed, and the programs were effective, and it was an interesting experience, but quite different from listening to lectures in law school.
And you went back to school after your enlistment. Did you use the Montgomery Bill?
No.
No.
Oh no, the Montgomery Bill, the GI Bill of Rights.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used, yes, my part of my tuition at Cornell Law School was paid under the GI Bill of Rights.
Okay. Was there anybody other than General Chieves that you remember? Any
Well,
things that stick out?
no, well, I remember Colonel Orland, who was my first commander after I was commissioned, and he was of the old school. He made the junior officers march to his tune, but he was, even though he was strict, he was kind. And so, yeah, I remember Colonel Orland. But General Chieves was the commander that I had worked most closely with, and for the longest period of time. Okinawa. Well, actually, briefly in Hawaii, and then Okinawa, and then Korea. 24th Corps.
Mm-hmm. What was your reaction to Pearl?
Well, I was a senior at Colgate. And I was walking down Broad Street that Sunday afternoon in December 1941, and it was a shock. Somebody came, but there were 3 or 4 of us walking down Broad Street towards downtown Hamilton, and somebody came running out of one of the fraternity houses and said the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor and the war, we're going to go to war. And that was a real shock to those of us who were deeply engrossed in our senior year at college, studying for the final exams and writing senior term papers, etc. But it was very interesting, the class my class at Colgate, which included Andy Rooney, who had been drafted in July or August of 1941. He didn't finish his senior year. But about 85%, almost 90% of our class enlisted or were drafted. So the number of classmates who went off to war was very substantial.
And you enlisted?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I was under draft age. I think the draft age then was either 20 or maybe 19, and I had, I hadn't yet turned 19. I was still 18. And I just felt it was my duty to go off and help my classmates and my fellow citizens win the war. And I wasn't at that point in time certain whether my assignment would be in the United States or in European theater or in the Pacific theater. But it was just my patriotic duty. And that was the prevailing spirit at the time. It was the duty of service that we all owed to our country.
And that was all throughout your entire era?
Yes. Well, my experience during the war experiences were interesting, and they weren't heroic, but they were interesting. The assignments I had, and the people I met, and the locations where I was stationed, and we until the Japanese surrendered, we were all committed to making certain that the war would end in Europe. Until the Nazis surrendered, the war would go on in Europe and go on in Pacific until the Japanese surrendered. And it was I would say 99.5% of the American people shared that view. Because we were the victims of the attack, and the European war had been going on for a while before we became involved, but the Pacific War hadn't been. So the commitment of the military and the civilians who stayed at home and worked in the factories and performed civilian jobs that were supportive of the military missions, they shared the same commitment to their country, our country.
Did you have any family members or relatives that served with you?
No, I was the only son of my parents, and my sister didn't go into the service. And my father was an immigrant from Wales, and most of my cousins were still living in Wales, and they were with the British Army in Europe. But I didn't know them all that well. I met 2 or 3 of them, but we didn't really share experiences.
Did you keep up on news about like the V-2 rocket bombing
Yes.
on London?
Yeah.
Were you scared for them?
Yes.
Did you ever think that Germany was going to take over Britain?
Well, I'm an optimist, and I was then, and I was, in my mind, I was quite certain that the British would survive. But there were reasons to question that theory. The war in Europe was more complicated. The aspects of the war in Europe were somewhat more complicated than the war in the Pacific.
So the Pacific was a lot easier?
Well, it wasn't easier if you were fighting the Japanese, but it wasn't as complicated to think through the strategies and to agree on the desired outcomes.
Did you travel from Hawaii to
Okinawa.
on boat or plane?
Boat.
Boat?
Yeah.
So it was always by boat that you traveled? Or
Well, after the war, after the Japanese surrendered, and we went into Korea, I would occasionally fly from Seoul, Korea, to Japan, to the American air bases in Japan. But most of our travel was by boat.
During before the Japanese surrender, were you worried about Japanese subs?
Oh, sure.
Was there any like threats of Japanese sub?
Not to any of the ships that I was on.
Any of the ships around you, like
Well,
they were traveling in?
the Hawaiian Islands had really been protected, and were not in danger in 1944. By the time as we approached Okinawa, yes, there was the possibility that the Japanese subs would attack the American ships. But none of them did. And as I said earlier, when our forces, the 24th Corps, went to Korea, or went to Okinawa, the infantry troops had pretty much pushed the Japanese back from the east coast of Okinawa back into South Okinawa and the western part of the island. So the battle for Okinawa was getting close to an end when our troops got there. But it had been different when the American troops invaded in April.
Was there anybody that you admired the most? Like, was it General Chieves or anybody?
Well, I admired all the troops who were in combat. I mean, I admired and respected them, and because they were putting their lives at stake, and protecting us, whether it was in Europe in the Battle of the Bulge or some of the other battles in Europe, or whether it was in the Pacific, Okinawa or Guam. But I didn't have any one person in mind at that time.
Okay. And how long did it take you to achieve the rank of major?
Well, I enlisted in June of 1942. I was commissioned in June of 1943, and I made major in either August or September of 1945. So it was 1 year as an enlisted man, and 2 years and 2 or 3 months before I went from second lieutenant to major.
What did it take to go from private all the way up to major?
Hard work. and doing your duty, following your commander's orders, and having an interest in the missions that you were assigned to perform.
Okay. So what'd you do after the war? You went back to school?
I went to Cornell Law School, yes, and enrolled in Cornell Law School.
How long did you stay there?
3 years. 3 years. And then I practiced, after law school, I practiced for 2 years in Lockport, New York, and then I came back to Rome in fall of 1952. I opened my office, and I've been here for 49 plus years practicing law. Of course, I've had other activities. I was on the State Board of Regents for 23 years, representing the 5 counties of central New York, and that was quite time consuming. But
those are the people that make up the tests?
well, they supervise all education in New York State, from kindergarten through postdoctoral. In other words, they are responsible for setting policies for elementary schools, secondary schools, and colleges and universities. And they charter colleges, private and public, and they also govern or oversee 38 licensed professions. And in the course of governing elementary and secondary schools or setting policies for them, they oversee the examination, regents' examination process. The regents don't write the exams. The state education department staff do that. But we set, the regents set policy for schools at all levels. It was a very interesting experience. I was the only Oneida County resident to serve on the Board of Regents in the 20th century. And it was a fascinating experience.
Did you ever think about re-enlisting or being called back to duty?
No, as I said, I stayed in the reserves for about 3.5 years. But I found the practice of law and my other activities, community service and service on the Board of Regents, to be very worthwhile. And I really never considered rejoining the military. No, there wasn't. A couple of times I thought about the possibility of going back into the reserves, the JAG Corps, the Judge Advocate General portion of the reserve, the lawyers portion, but I didn't do it because my law schedule prevented that. And the other factor here was that there wasn't that compelling need to rejoin the military that I had felt in 1942.
Okay.
I have a few questions if we have time.
Go ahead.
You talked a lot about Korea. Was there ever any chance of being recalled for Korean service during the Korean conflict?
No, being a major, I was not subject to recall. Field grade officers were not subject to recall. And I had just started practicing law, and my feeling at the time was that I needed to complete my law education.
When you were in Korea as an administrative officer, did you have any notion of the brewing conflict between the Soviets and
Yes.
U.S. interests, and were you involved in that in any way?
Well, not directly, but part of that, getting the network of English-speaking Koreans together was related to the challenges posed by the Russian soldiers or the Russian troops in North Korea.
So
We were stationed. I was stationed at a base. The headquarters for the occupation force was between Incheon and Seoul, and we were only about 4 miles south of the 38th parallel. So we had reason to think about the possible threats of the Soviet troops, but they never materialized. And I think what had happened was the top staff of the occupation forces in South Korea did a good job communicating with occupation forces of the Russian troops. But the tensions that evolved into the Korean War were apparent even in 1946 and obviously in the later years.
These people of the Korean underground, did they have any particular role in the South Korean government the United States supported after the war?
They became involved, some of them, yes.
You mentioned something else that I thought was pretty interesting. let's see if I got this straight. At West Point, you spent some time involved or studying the transition from the Army was making from the Air Corps to the Air Force. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, I think the transition started in 1946, and it was really an administrative process. It was changing the chains of command, and more emphasis on the flight mission and less emphasis on the ground missions.
Was there any controversy at all? Was it a smooth transition? Can you tell us about that?
I didn't sense any real controversy. It became apparent that the Air Corps needed to be an independent agency because the missions were different from the ground forces missions, and the chain of command in both organizations needed to be separated. So I think there was consensus about separating the Air Corps from the Army.
What kind of work did you do in that process?
Well, the summer school for reserve officers really dealt with history of the different units and the mission statements, etc. I wasn't real. We the students, the reserve officers, weren't really involved in the negotiations. The negotiations went on in Washington, the Pentagon.
Just another small question. This General Chieves that you've spoken of, his last name is Cheeves?
Yes.
His first name, do you recall?
I think it was Adam. I hadn't signed his name in 50 years, no, 45 years.
Now, working on his staff, I got probably almost the same question again, but did any, can you recall any significant historical events that more or less crossed his desk and crossed your desk that you noticed?
Well, not when we were in Okinawa, because that battle was dying down. The Japanese had been pushed back. When we were in Korea, some of the tension that was created by the 38th parallel dividing the Russian troops from occupation forces from the American occupation forces, some of those tensions were obvious. But the real mission of the American or U.S. occupation force in Korea in 1945, 46, and on through to the beginning of the Korean War was to rebuild the economy of South Korea and the political structure. Mm-hmm. Because the Japanese had really dominated Korea and had controlled the economy and controlled the government.
Did the Korean people at all see you as liberators?
Yes. At least those that we talked to. Yes, I think they did. And the Koreans who are now living in this area, and there's a sizable number. There's for example, a Korean Presbyterian congregation that uses the chapel at the First Presbyterian Church for Sunday morning worship. And several of those people are Korean wives of American soldiers and descendants of Korean parents. And they share some of their memories, and they have positive reactions to what the results were from the American occupation of South Korea.
I have another general type of question. As a student of history, I look at World War II as a time was filled with a lot of larger-than-life figures. I'm thinking of people like Churchill, FDR, MacArthur.
Eisenhower.
Eisenhower, obviously, sure. Any thoughts on those gentlemen? Any thoughts, especially MacArthur being in that theater?
Well, I wasn't at the command level where I was dealing with any of those people. But FDR had a very positive image. Churchill had a very positive image. I once met MacArthur, but never really dealt with him. And of course, General Eisenhower was in the European theater. In wartime, the commanders are in charge, and the civilian commander is the president or the prime minister in Britain, and then the military generals, the 4-star general or 5-star generals, are the commanders, and the troops or the officers and enlisted personnel down further don't really have that kind of personal contact with any of those decision makers.
What was your impression of MacArthur?
Well, I had a positive reaction to him. He was in charge, but not having regular dealings with him, I didn't have a definite impression. I accepted his role, and at that time I thought he was making the right decisions. And as you heard me say, when Harry Truman made the decision to drop the 2 bombs, we all agreed that those were the right decisions.
I think we're probably near the end. Is there anything else you'd like to say as we wrap this interview up? Any other comments or thoughts about your service or anything else related?
No, I just, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this portion of history with you. I think it's important for Americans to have a better understanding of the events of the past, because they help us put the challenges of the present in perspective. And I think the war on terrorism is an example of why we need to look at the options that were available in past history, and which ones were implemented and which ones worked and which ones didn't work. And so I think that history gives a perspective to the current challenges that people, not only in the United States but in countries around the world, now face. And I applaud the Rome Free Academy for having this program, and I hope that it enables students of today to understand the decisions of the past, and to understand that oftentimes the decisions are difficult to make and sometimes difficult to implement. But we have to look at what's in the best interests of the general public, and go forward to and participate in our government, in our economy, and remember that America is a nation of many different people of many different backgrounds. We come together in crisis times, and I think this is a crisis time, and I think that as we look back at the decisions made in World War II and in World War I, and to a somewhat lesser extent in the Korean War, I think I think the lessons of history help us develop a perspective for the present and the future.
Well, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Now you can, there's another map you have. Did you get a couple of pictures of these?
No.